Hello and welcome to this video. I am with the jazz drummer and jazz documentary filmmaker Ben Makinen. He's been on the channel many a time. He's a regular now. He's not only a jazz musician who knows his jazz inside out, he may even have a knowledge of jazz history that's equal to mine. But I wouldn't like to say this, but he definitely does. And because he makes jazz documentaries, he's always researching into new areas, interesting areas, which, Ben, I assume if you're making a new documentary, you don't want to say what everyone said before. So I assume you're looking at new angles. Is that right, when you decide to do something?
Yeah, for the most part, it's not that it's never been said. Actually, I feel that a lot of what I'm doing is just acting as a messenger. I'm able to find things that have been buried or left. Um,
That's more what I mean. Yes, things that
yeah,
aspects of the form that have been forgotten or glossed
yeah.
over.
For example, there's a lot of research done by people over the years, like PhD archivists, historians, that they do incredible work. They write a paper, it gets published within their community, and then
Mm,
sits at the bottom of And thanks to the internet, we're able to actually go into some of those forgotten files, so to speak, and find these
yeah.
obscure papers, and and these obscure papers oftentimes add like critical context or nuance to something that a lot of us have taken for granted. The way I look at it is people who see themselves as experts in jazz, for example. This applies to really all
Mm,
fields. We you assume you're an expert because you assume that your foundation is built on some solid information. And what
mm,
happens is we find out that our foundation is really like the third level of a building. We built on the third level. We didn't actually start on the foundation.
mm,
And of course, as you know, history, it's fluid. It's fluid in the sense that as soon as we think something, so all you have to do is find a letter, an article, a photograph
yeah.
that was overlooked, and now suddenly, we've got a new story. So, with this recent film of mine, Echoes of Tradition, we're looking into the influence of some Native American music and culture on the birth of jazz. Now, what's interesting is this film, it's a beautiful cinematic film that uplifts the voices of everyone
Mm,
in it. It's not the film itself does not portray any controversy or anger. No one dies and no one's going to
mm,
court or battling. It's a beautiful film in that sense. And it's also kind of a starter kit. It's almost a chapter one. There are people who are completely unaware of the influence of Native Americans in the birth of jazz, or the influence of Native Americans in most anything really, because they're, as a people, they were so uh, just, well, almost eliminated, but ostracized. They were completely pushed out of American culture, history,
mm,
awareness. So, but the film basically asks the audience that I present the audience with the stories of other people, which is really serves as an invitation back to the table that these underrepresented people helped build in the first place. So it's not taking anything away from anyone. The heroes of jazz are pretty much set in stone. You know this, Andy. The Kid Ories and the Baby Dodds and the Freddie Keppards. No one can change that. We know who they are, but the influences are what change, and the people that have not been identified that were there with them or that were influencing these people. Oftentimes they're women,
mm,
oftentimes they're Native Americans, Creoles. We've gone over this before, but
mm,
what happened with Echoes of Tradition, and I'm saying this because while I was editing Echoes of Tradition, I just started to come across more and more evidence that went further back and validated even more, brought much more detailed facts, people, stories, recordings of music that are not in this first film. So I really see this as kind of a conversational starter, a chapter one. What it also does, Echoes of Tradition is really not just about Native Americans. There's LGBTQ plus, there's black, there's white. As I've been informed, the term is normative. There's a normative white woman in the film. We're hearing from we're hearing from a wide variety of people, everyone except a white man. I just sat down the other night and I realized, because as you know, I've been under attack for releasing this film.
Well, this is what I just want to open up for the audience. We normally would be here. This would be a nice little video. Not many people would watch it because you've got a new documentary out.
Right.
It's not contentious. It's like I'll be going, Ben Makinen's talking about his new jazz documentary, and ostensibly that's what we're here to do. But,
right. But
when you came on the channel a year or so ago and raised this issue that the Native Americans might have been involved in the creation of jazz, the pushback that I got was quite incredible. It was like, I mean, I've said something even worse than my saying I don't think that black people invented jazz uniquely, which is the thing I said that was, and it's the same point, isn't it?
It's similar.
We're looking at other influences on the creation of jazz.
Well, that's right. Other influences. And the one thing we didn't do very well in our first round was define the terms. And this is where, a round robin, a larger discussion would be nice. But when we start talking about Black, jazz, Native American, Creole, those are four terms that we really need to define, because as we found out, there's thousands of people around the world who have different definitions. They don't even realize the lens that they're coming from. People get emotionally reactive and defensive when they hear a word before understanding how that word is defined.
Before we get to defining terms, just to say the central claim that you're making in this documentary very simply,
I'll put it simply for your simple,
so that people who don't know about this can see where we're starting. Just a simple claim that you make in the documentary.
Here's a simple claim for all of for the 50,000+ subscribers to Andy Edwards' show, who, by the way, you always introduce me as a great jazz drummer, and I appreciate that, but you're a pretty kick-ass prog rock dude yourself. I love what you do.
I don't want to be a kick-ass prog rock. Oh, I wanted to be a kick-ass jazz drummer.
Well, you're an average guitarist. How about if I tell you that? You're a passionate average guitar. No, I can't play guitar. I love when I watch you. I know how well you play the drums, and then I see you playing guitar. I'm like, God dang it! Now I got to go learn guitar. So thank you, Andy. Listen, for the beautiful followers here, subscribers, and people watching the show, I'll just put it straight up. I've been accused of being a white man stealing the Native American story. That's the working class interpretation of what I'm going to share with you.
So that's the pushback that you've got. So what was your claim about the Native American? What are you claiming about Native Americans? Something bad or something good? Because that makes a difference. So what are you claiming about Native Americans?
No. Here's the thing. I'm not claiming anything. I'll be clear.
Well, then what does the documentary impart to the audience? We need to, because we're talking around it, because you've been under attack. You're obviously trying to make sure all your terms are correct. But for somebody watching this, they need to know exactly what we're going to be discussing. So does it say that Native Americans invented jazz? Does it say that Native Americans came in and made jazz really brilliant, and they're like the special factor that turns it into something wonderful? What is it what's coming out in this documentary that you're claiming about Native Americans? What would it be?
Let me invite your listeners to answer that for themselves by watching the movie for free. Because this question has come up, I've put the film Echoes of Tradition for free now on my new Patreon page, Ben's Jazz Curve. And the easiest way I think to find it, it's a new page. If you just Patreon/Ben Makinen,
or just click on the link below, so they can sign up to your Patreon below.
For free.
For free, and then watch it there for free.
That's correct.
Brilliant.
That's correct. It's a 1-hour documentary, and I wanted the movie is other people's story. I'm just a vessel. It was very important for me on this film to keep me out of it. I'm not in it. I don't talk, and everyone I interview is telling their own story. The contention is really only coming, it began with two people who are in the movie. And this is where I'm going to encourage your viewers. presumably they're watching this. It's already been taped. If you want to watch the movie without knowing any of the dramatic backstory, watch the movie, because the movie is a delight. It's a cinematic, charming, uplifting, cool, with some interesting ideas and some great music. And if you're not familiar with the idea of Native Americans influencing the beginning of jazz, in essence, we introduce you to the idea that the primary rhythms found in jazz, the shuffle rhythm, 4/4 shuffle, let's just say, that is present. It is predominantly present in much Native American music.
So if I could just jump in, what I think we'll do is I'm going to do the cardinal sin of YouTube, which, as I'm saying, pause this video or stop it, go down, click the link, watch it, and then come back. And then from now on, at this point, we will be discussing the documentary. Okay.
Right. Hello, Andy. Thanks for having me on your show. Great to be back. Let me clean the popcorn out of my teeth. That was a great movie. Echoes of Tradition, Ben's Patreon page, Ben's Jazz Curve.
Well, I want to throw something at you then. Now we've established the idea of a rhythm. There's something about jazz. See, a lot of my explorations of jazz come from these. They come from my ears. I listen and I go, yes. That's the thing. I listen to the music and then I read the history and it goes, the history doesn't seem to be describing what the music's doing. So one of the things
now give me an example of that. Give us an example of what you mean by that.
You get into your early jazz. There's no early jazz till we hear the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917. Okay.
Well, I found some going back to 1916, but let's start with
I've listened to that stuff. But there's the whole point about those ones in 1916 is they weren't popular. So this is a part of the history no one says. Original Dixieland Jazz Band sold a ton of records, and within a few years they were in London, Europe touring.
Well, that's just it. There's
something about that popularity record that blew everybody away.
Well, because the question is, why does an album get the Nomer first jazz record? And one of the criteria probably has to be popularity.
Popularity, so this is really important. Then you get this sort of renaissance happen because it's been driven by the money, and then your geniuses come in, Jelly Roll Morton, you have originally King Oliver, and then Louis Armstrong, Fletcher Henderson. The whole thing it emerges here. And then there's sort of anomalies, because you look at Fletcher Henderson, well, you think, my God, he's doing big bad jazz in 1923. Where the hell did that come from? And then you start to realise that there was another history of sort of cocktail dance bands, James Europe being a black composer that was in that realm. And so that must have been...
He led a 100-piece orchestra.
Yeah, so anyway, you've suddenly got Fletcher Henderson, right? You've got your New Orleans jazz. Now, the New Orleans jazz is basically this beat, isn't it? Boom.
2/4.
2/4, syncopated 2/4. Then suddenly, when the big bands kick in, the rhythm completely changes. Late 20s, early thoughts. And now we got
4/4.
Walking bass line. The whole rhythm section changes. The New Orleans front line is completely gone or assimilated into the big band, but that was already there, so I don't quite understand that bit. And suddenly you've got, Joe Jones, Count Basie, hi-hat, double bass, and all that. Where did that come from? And then when you discuss the history of it, when you discuss the history with people, they go, well, the African influence is in the rhythms. And I'm going, well, I can hear Spanish in Jelly Roll Morton's, I can hear marching band in Louis Armstrong. The thing that jazz has got, that sound, which is that's not there to start off with. Where did it come from?
And let's go back to what you said, that now you're getting onto the juice of one of the other issues. That's right, Andy. That's one of the tropes. Jazz gets its rhythm from Africa. We all know that. That's what people say. And what you're saying, if I may, let's go back to 1917. Not that the ODJB was the only band playing. They represented what got into the studio. As you and I both know, the studio, Victor Talking Machine Records, actually asked Freddie Keppard to come in and play first. He said, no, that's another story. Point is, in 1917, the music that we hear does not have African rhythms. Now, being like, if most of the slaves in America came from the west coast of Africa. We're generalizing, Sahara, sub-Saharan. The rhythms found predominantly in that, much of those rhythms aren't the rhythms you just described. Doom, doom, doom. It's da 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 da. Complex, great triplet-based, cool 12/8 stuff, right?
We love it.
We don't hear. No one's playing that. No one's playing that in the early jazz. We don't hear those amazing, great African rhythms, which play a hugely important part in later jazz. In 30s with Dizzy. Well,
Dizzy in the 40s.
Well, before that. 1930s, Mario Bauza started bringing that in, started sneaking it in with Chick Webb's band, and later. Point is, it started coming in from Cuba, right? Africa via Cuba. The point is African rhythms play a crucial part in jazz later. They're not existent in the start. What's existent
now,
is
if you really want, this is how heavy we on this channel we get into this. I interviewed Roland. Interviewed Roland Vasquez, who's a jazz fusion musician, Latin American musician. He's worked with Ayetu and Alex Acuna, real serious guy, and he was explaining very specific things about certain indigenous groups in South America and where certain rhythms come from. This isn't, you can't just say, this is the mistake everybody makes, is that my central position is these things are made by individuals, genius individuals in small groups, and they come out with things. And so to just see it like there's these, because this is the problem with looking at things in terms of identity categories like we do now, because people didn't think of identity 100 years ago like we do now. So we're assigning identity groups. We're going Native Americans. That's ridiculous. Which Native Americans?
Let me reel this in, because one of the dangers here that we've already allowed to get out of the box is what I'm not saying. It's that there's a important distinction when I make the claim I don't hear African rhythms in early jazz.
No.
I don't hear it in the early New Orleans 2-beat, and I don't hear it in the later 1920s 4-beat. But let's be clear, African Americans are making that music, right? I'm not saying, I don't think anyone's saying that the African Americans weren't a central and important part of this musical history. They are.
But the thing is, what I'm not going to do anymore, right, is have to bow to this ideology that has to say the bleeding obvious, which is that black people had the greatest influence on the creation of jazz. In that, there is something much stronger going through this music form that does go back to slavery. And the fact that if you actually study it and you look at the slavery, then you look at Reconstruction, then you look at Jim Crow, and actually what's happening is their identity categories are moving around. Once you're a slave, then you're not a slave. You're free, but now it's Jim Crow. And the Creoles, right? The Creoles, who like Freddie Keppard, Jelly Roll Morton, Sidney Bechet, these are Creoles. Now, if you go to an identity-based person, they're going to go, well, they're black, aren't they? But at the time, it's not about what I say they are, or you say they are. It's the fact that their role was changing in the grand scheme of this awful situation in America.
Hold on, the Creoles. We're getting a little ahead. We're getting a little ahead, and I think you're getting excited too, and this is important for everyone to recognize, is that
what I'm doing is you're going down a route trying to describe it within a certain criteria, because you've been attacked. So you're stepping very carefully so that you've said all this. So you go, we're not saying that black people didn't involved in jazz, blah, blah, blah. We have to say this. We've got to say this. And I'm trying to make the point.
It's okay. It's okay to say stuff.
African Americans as a label does not describe what was going on back then. It just doesn't describe it. You have to drop that to understand what's going on. And I know that sounds really
you either have to drop it or be more clear with the definitions. And that's what I mean, going back to black. I mean, we've used the word black, but that's getting a little further away from the scope of the controversy surrounding my film. There is none of that surrounding my film yet.
No. There will be after you do this video, because this is what we're saying about treading carefully. Once it gets out there that you're claiming that part of the genesis of jazz was with Native Americans, That's nearly as bad as saying part of the genesis of jazz was with white people, right? That is the problem. It's a
I
sort
don't
of
find
go into this area
I
because
don't find any of that problematic or bad. I mean, I know what you're saying. Other people will,
other
but
people will. I mean, it's absolutely uncategorically the case that jazz was created in the biggest melting pot in the world at the time because it was created in a melting pot. And there was
that's right.
nobody in New Orleans separating all the blacks off and keeping them there. And the blacks were there creating jazz in their jazz laboratory, going, keep the white influences out, keep the Native American influences. I know. Why did we bother making it in this melting pot for? It's the worst place. We should have done it in Africa. This is absolutely idiotic. You see,
Well,
idiotic thinking.
all right, all right. Let's just take a big breath here. You look
But
like
the
you're in
thing
a
is that you're saying, you said, well, let's
no,
build
no,
it on
no.
foundations. The foundations are that this music's American music, and America was full of different people, right? And the reason why black people are so important in the history of jazz is because they had no way of expressing themselves. They had this one place, this one music form that represented some sort of freedom or some way of expressing themselves. And so black geniuses were able to come into the music form and do something. I mean, people like Paul Whiteman in a way were slumming it, weren't they? Because they weren't classical musicians. You see what I mean? And then the Creoles, who had Creole orchestras in the 1860s, 1870s, once they were demarked as being suddenly now you're black, they had to then move from the orchestras down into these ragtime, marching bands and make their living there, bringing in that influence. That is how jazz was created. It's out of that creation. And so I'm actually nipping this in the bud right at the start. That I'm starting this, and if people don't like it, they can switch off because there's that thing going on. Da 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 da. There's that. But I'm not going to be pushed around by it anymore. Jazz was created by all sorts of different people, and they all brought things in. This is just anyone who tries to argue against this is just not seeing common sense. So the idea that you had Native Americans in America and that they weren't involved in New Orleans, where they have parades celebrating Native Americans by black people, that didn't influence the music at that point or any point. It's just absolutely absurd. So I have to have my say there.
I think, did you feel that you got your say in? It felt like you got a good little.
Well, I think we got the foundation. We have to get the foundation in because you're trying to argue you've been attacked. I'm very aware when this video comes out, there's going to be a whole.
I'd love to explain. I'd love to explain my position. I don't necessarily agree with everything you just said. That's not my position, and that's not what I'm here saying.
So what don't you agree with? What don't you agree with? You have to get this foundation right. What don't you agree with?
Now, what the foundation? Let's go back. I want to talk about the film Echoes of Tradition, because the foundation here that's being laid out is that Native American or indigenous people, sometimes they're called First Nation, were on the North American continent first, before any European colonizers and before any Africans were brought over as slaves. And there's some pretty great history that shows not every African that was brought over was a slave. Interesting article in Time magazine. Actually, there was a millionaire. There was a very wealthy.
Well, we could point to the black slave owners in America.
Hold on a sec. Hold on. What I'm trying to say is the role of Native Americans is that being a people living on the North American continent, they were for thousands of years making their own music, right? That music happens to have the shuffle beat in it. It's there's thousands of tribes, so we're generalizing here, but in this movie we look at the Muskogee, and there's research that points to the Sioux Indians, for example, for musical examples. The stomp dance of the Muskogee Indians, turtle shells filled with rattles on the women's ankles in a simple dance creates a we have the heartbeat that is ubiquitous. It's global. The heartbeat is fairly human. This is the point I want to make. It's not in the movie. Remember, Echoes of Tradition is other people presenting their findings, presenting the stories from their elders in their tribes and their own personal story. I've listened to them I've uplifted, I've given them a platform to tell their story, and it's there in the movie for you to discover on their terms. Myself, as a jazz musician and as a documentary filmmaker, I've done a lot more research during that process and since. So there's much more to share here. But the point is that anyone making music in America after the we could say it as late as the 1600s. It's arguable people were arriving here in the 1500s, but if we just say from 1600 forward, anyone living on the North American continent, or what would become known as America, was hearing Native American music. It was there. It was they had their ceremonial music. You could hear it over the hills if the Indians had been pushed out, or in the case of Africans who were brought over as slaves, there was an incredible amount of assimilation. Runaway slaves would assimilate, marry, have children with Native American tribes. There was a great intersection of culture. So we're hearing native drums now. It's part of the background. So for the next 3 centuries, 2.5 centuries at least, depending on how we count, everyone's hearing doom, 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 doom. They're hearing Native American drums. They're there. They're everywhere in America because Native Americans are everywhere. They're hearing shuffle rhythms around the fire, around the stomp dances, for example. These are simple rhythms that are found all over the world. There's nothing uniquely American to a 4/4 beat. We all have heartbeats. We can find these beats. The thing is the African slaves, even if they had their own secret societies, or some of them kept some of those rhythms alive, we weren't hearing them. They don't present themselves in any of the music that comes out of America: country, blues, ragtime, march, minstrelsy, vaudeville, any of the Appalachian. We don't hear we don't hear the complex, incredibly cool rhythms from West Africa until the 30s or 40s. So that's one way of someone getting their head around why and how do we know this? Because people like Jack Teagarden, the trombonist in Louis Armstrong's band, says growing up as a kid, he heard Negro spirituals and he heard Native American powwow dance music where he was growing up in Texas and Oklahoma. We have Mildred Bailey talking about her singing style being influenced by the Native American singing that she learned from her tribe, in the Coeur d'Alene tribe. We have Oscar Pettiford, bassist, first bebop bass player, recorded with Coleman Hawkins in 1944. Rainbow Mist, I think, is the record. February 22, 1944. Oscar Pettiford, full-blooded mother. His mother was a full-blooded Choctaw Indian. His father was a half-blooded Cherokee. Oscar Pettiford, the African-American bebop jazz bass player, who's 3/4 Native American Indian, told his wife that not enough credit is given to the Native American Indian for the 4/4 rhythm of jazz. And he told her that the study of Native American music has been overlooked. And he wouldn't say that publicly among his peers. He didn't want to lose gigs. He didn't want to sully his reputation. This came out after he died.
Yeah, I know about this.
Jacqueline Pettiford wrote a letter to Downbeat. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is there's a record of people, of great jazz musicians who acknowledged that they were hearing these things. There's another great story of a Oneida Indian tribal member. His name was Chief Wheelock, Chief James Riley Wheelock. And in 1917, he became the first full-blooded Native American to lead an all-Negro big band for the U.S. Army, the infantry regiment in Europe. So we have a Native American leading an African American band playing jazz music to the Europeans. Well, when he comes back to America, he goes back to his tribe, puts a band together. It's a further cross influence. Chief Riley Wheelock came out of the Carlisle School, which is a Native boarding school. He was a famous band director and teacher at a time in which the U.S. government, about a decade earlier, had made an attempt to reconnect Native American students at these boarding schools with their tribal music. there had been a big attempt to squash it, to push it out. Studies were done. It's an interesting story. Point is there's a breadcrumb trail here for anyone who questions this that goes back to the great jazz musicians themselves saying, we were hearing native drums, we were hearing the native flutes, the again, Mildred Bailey and the singing, the inflections, the laying back.
It's more than just the rhythm. And I also think Cab
Well, it's rhythm and it's improvisation.
I also think that Cab Calloway, who was hang on, I need
Calloway,
to say something, Ben. I need to be able to say something.
Here's a very simple thing.
If you want to film a video and come on and I'll put it up on the channel, but I do need to talk to you. I'm finding really hard to get across anything at the moment.
Let me just do three things. A lot of people like to say jazz is blues, swing, and improvisation. You and I both know that's an obscene simplification, because we can show you examples of jazz music that has none of those three in it. But if we were to agree that jazz is comprised of blues, which is ill-defined at this moment, what is blues? But if it's blues, swing, and improvisation, all three of those elements are found in Native American music. The blues scale. Now, people like to say the blues, you and I both know, blues was not used to describe music in America until maybe 1905, 1906. Blues didn't refer to a genre of music or a form. The idea of a 12-bar, 1-4-5 formulaic approach to music, that comes later. But in terms of scooping notes, flatted thirds, sevenths, and all this, that sort of the wailing, the moaning, the expressivity that we associate with blues, that's in Native American music. I
really think as we have this conversation, the major problem here, which is why I'm trying to get this across.
Movie. Why did people fight against this movie?
Because of the gaze in which they're looking at it. That is why.
No, you don't. But we haven't talked about it yet. The two people who got upset about me releasing this movie, there are two musicians I interviewed, and they have not even watched the film yet. So what happened is I made a Facebook post sharing an award this film won at a lower level film festival, but it's an award, and I wanted to share it with the cast. I wanted to highlight the great stories and music that everyone in the film had made. That's when these two people came out and said, I do not give you permission to tell my story. And it escalated from there into some pretty defamatory, racist, ugly things against me. That's all been documented. Of course, they had some attack dogs. They had people like proxy posters. They get their friends to put up some pretty nasty things on Instagram. But the point was, it came down to a contention of legal permission. And this is what's really interesting and good for any documentary filmmaker or even a studio musician. Having your contracts in order, having clear communication, and conducting yourself ethically, which I believe I have done. And I found myself having to kind of prove that. So in a way, this was good for me to be attacked, because it forced me to be clear with my methods and my intentions. And my intention is, in the end, everyone's story, everyone who appears in the movie is shown exactly as they presented themselves after signing releases with me. Every single person in the movie, I have a signed talent release that makes it clear that I'm able to use their story in any way. One of the big contentions is that the working title I had on the release is not the title Echoes of Tradition of the film. What I do have, Andy, is I have not only signed releases, I have screenshots now of a text thread that I shared that transpired between myself and the woman in question who's attacking me. That text thread makes it very clear that when I approached her to sit for an interview, I said, I'm making a movie about women, and I understand you have Native legacy and history. Would you like to talk about your upbringing as a Native American, how it affects you as a jazz singer today, the matriarchal perspective of being a Native? And I went on, and she responded, yes, I'm excited to talk about that with you. Well, now she's claiming that I took her story, I took her interview that should have only been about women in jazz, and now I'm telling the Native American story. She hasn't even seen the movie. We've got Native Americans.
This is what I was trying to get across earlier. This is what I was really trying to do earlier. I don't think we've established this. I'll have to just say this out and out, right? Because this is what I'm trying to get across. you have
Okay.
walked into the fact that you are claiming the Native Americans were involved in the creation of jazz. Now,
That's right.
if you say that, and then you've got working jazz musicians who are quite happy to go on and say, I'm a female jazz musician and I've got, prejudice against me, blah, blah, blah. But then
That's
if
right.
they get tarred in with this other identity cause, they're going to not like that.
Well, here's something else. You're absolutely right, Andy.
That's what
And but what
that was what I was trying to get across earlier.
That's
Because
right.
what I was trying to say was, if you go back to the 1920s, 30s, Cab Calloway, who was, we would think of a black musician, was so influenced by Native American music and actively put it in to the music. And the thing with Cab Calloway is, because Cab Calloway was like a superstar pop star, sold millions of records, that affects, because the problem is we've got is a whole bunch, as soon as you take on identity ideology, a whole bunch of things come across that you even though you're trying to defend yourself or argue against it, you're still working in that line of thinking, right? So one of the problems we've got here is that because we're seeing everybody's been put in their identity category, right? That's the problem. She's female, she's Native American, okay? What this doesn't count is the amount of black people that just were influenced by Native American music, which
right.
I would imagine was much greater. People at 100%, because nobody's 100% anything. I'm not 100%. I don't think you
That's
are.
right.
But
That's right.
the point, that's my point. This is the point, that if you actually step back and apply common sense to this without, and try and just get out of thinking along those lines, you will go, well, surely everybody was listening to everything, and that was just part of the pot. That's what's going, and that why are we even arguing this?
Louis Armstrong talks about how wonderfully influenced he was by Bix Beiderbecke records.
Yeah.
And Louis is on record. It's in one of his autobiographies, I believe. He says, "Man, when Bix came out, we were like, wow, the orchestration, the way Bix put his band together was new. People, especially listening to records, you didn't care. Musicians don't care what color you are. They're listening to your sound.
Record sales, popularity. These are young people, then they're in their early 20s. Are they having a good time? Can they go off and get drunk, meet girls? That is what is driving this music form all the way through until the beboppers decide to turn it into something that's very intellectual and high elevated. This is why we haven't got history, because no one cared to actually work out what was going on. Nobody bothered. This is why nobody went to see Buddy Bolden in the sanitarium, because nobody cared about him until the 1930s.
Now you raise a really interesting point. I'm going to come right back to that. I love that point. I'm bookmarking it. Ping. The other thing about the woman who and her buddy, I don't know if I should name names. They're in the movies. It's not illegal.
Well, let people watch the film and then they can try and work out which one it
is. Yeah. Okay.
Sit there and go, well, everyone seems to be treated completely. Because I've got some comments on this as well that I think are very relevant.
Well, the last point I wanted to make about the controversy that this woman is coming from, one thing that's kind of unraveled, two things actually. When this whole firestorm exploded on Facebook, it was, I'm 15 hours ahead of America, so it happened when I was sleeping. I posted the poster with the award, woke up, and before I saw the attacks, I went to the direct message from a friend of mine, a guy who I actually kind of mentored when he was younger, and he's actually played with her in her band. And he sent me this long text saying, Ben, this is so racist and unfair of what's happening to you and what she's saying. It's so hypocritical, because I'll tell you why. And he listed all of this stuff that happened in her band to him and to others that show her being kind of unhinged and hypocritical on another level. In addition, what happened is right after or concurrent, when I interviewed her in New York City in 2023, she, of course, came and shared her story. She was open about it, eager to be there. In fact, I had pulled some favors and I booked the Blue Note in New York City. I got time to go. I got about 2 hours before the band came in for the sound check. I set up a beautiful little spot in front of the stage, set my lights. She walks in and goes, "Wow, man, I've been emailing the Blue Note for 2 years and they won't return my emails. I've been trying to get a gig here forever, and now you brought me in to make a movie." So she was thrilled. She tells a great story. She's fabulous on camera. You'll see her in the movie. But what I didn't know is at the same time, she had another documentary film crew, which is fine. A person can have 1,000 documentary film, doesn't matter. But she had another crew working on her story. I get the sense she was playing me. She wanted to see who could help her PR, who could help her get to the, out into the public first. And she's also a successful grant writer. And I've attempted to write grants too, right? In America, the grants are going to minority people. They don't give grants to white guys, even if I'm telling their story. So in order to get these grants, you have to establish that not only are you an underrepresented person, a minority or a Native American, but that your crew is, and that the money that they're going to grant you is going to be used to uplift the members of your underrepresented community. So she went on to then tell me that she wanted me to back off because she has the Native American film crew telling her story. Because it's time that the Native Americans tell their own story their own way. I don't know why she shared her story with me, but and that's another interesting backstory, because I went and saw her Instagram feed, and a ways back she was asking people for money to help pay this film crew to finish following her around to tell her story. And now I'm releasing a movie with part of her story because she shared her story with me, and so it's a multi-level thing that really challenged me, because I'll tell you one other thing. She shared some sexual harassment cases that she experienced as a woman in jazz. Some of the, during her university undergrad and graduate work at the Manhattan School of Music there in Manhattan. She spoke openly. She told me a great story, her story, and she shared it with me knowing that I was going to put it on film. A few days later, she texted me, "Ben, I'm really afraid I named names, and because given the complexity of the political, of getting gigs and the politics of getting gigs, please don't put any names in the movie." I said, "Fine, you got it." I had reviewed the tape. I said, "You mentioned one guy after you had delineated the gist of your story. No names will go in the movie. I got your back. I'm not here to make you look bad. I'm here to help you." So I did honor, even though I had the legal right to use everything she said in the film, I did honor that request. A year later, this comes up, and she told me, "Stop the movie." She told me, I didn't tell you could make the movie." She's telling me, "You stopped making that movie." And I'm like, and I had to kind of ask myself and go, no, in this case, I don't think she's right. The story is a much bigger thing. It's the parts are greater than this, the sum is greater than the parts. And it's important for the story to get out there, because it adds to the complexity and the confusion that you're addressing when you get worked up on the Andy Edwards show about definitions and identity politics. Yes, this is why.
Because the thing is that if you've got people out there that are utilizing this ideology to access government money to fund things based upon the color of their skin, okay? And then using that against other people to put them down, to try and cancel them, to shut them up. And the thing is that people wonder why I'm like this. In 1997, I set up my own, it was called Juggernaut Arts, and we were accessing arts funding. And as I went into this, I started to realize that the funding wasn't coming through to people who were poor. The money never got to anybody that was poor. The money got to people that were quite middle class, quite educated.
That's right.
And propped them up, and it actually created a little micro society of sort of artsy middle class people that were able to access funds because they were playing some sort of identity card. It wasn't. I didn't want the money to go to people because they were black. I was working in urban areas making hip hop with really underprivileged black kids, and I could see their situation.
That's cool, man.
But they weren't getting the money. They were benefiting from the music we were making. They were able to come and sit in one of my sessions, make a track, take it away on CD, and bang it up on pirate radio, which is they loved. I was happy with that. But then I started that act was slowly shifting, and it went from people getting paid to enable poor people to access creativity to they were getting the money. And then they were walking around, and they were all very politically charged, and they knew how to play the game.
That's right.
And I saw this over and over again. And I also saw the way they would use that to shut people up. And it's not this is just, it's not even what I thought when you first said, because what it is she knows how to apply for money. She's got the money. She's making this documentary. So your documentary has to go in the age of years. Now, if she was some very poor person living on the streets, fair enough. Maybe she should be able to have her voice. But is she? Is she a poor person living on the streets, or is she actually part of the middle classes? And she's, working in the most snotty middle class style of music on the planet, which is what jazz is right now. And so it's a lot of privileged middle class people arguing over what they own. And if you step back, you go, ugh.
If you step back, you see we're a group of artists and musicians trying to elevate the music we all love. And it goes back, the irony is, as we debate things and talk about identity, this or the musicians that we love that make up this legacy of jazz, the music doesn't change no matter how much we talk about it. That's what we love. At the end of the day, whatever your politics are, we sit down and that Coleman Hawkins, John Coltrane, Fletcher Henderson, we love it. We all love it. So
I'm sure this woman's an amazing musician, and I'm sure she's brilliant. But the thing is, isn't it a shame that I don't know who she is, but what I'm saying, there's the possibility she could be absolutely fantastic. But the game that is going on here is not going to enable anybody at all. And if you go, well, what's the problem, Andy? Is it there's nice people? Ben's trying to say he's in the right. Maybe she's in the right. We're hearing one side of it. But what I'm trying to alert people to is that jazz is American music made by Americans. And America is an incredible country because it's built on a constitution where people, although they came from different, I'm going to call them tribal or family backgrounds, had to negotiate with each other. And what happened when you have people negotiating with each other in the way that happened in America is you become a powerful country on the face of the earth. You're the most, and that is the thing because they don't want to take into account things like capitalism, commerce, the business, jazz. We're talking about jazz because it was the most popular music form from the 1920s to the 1930s. And then when the beboppers came out and it split and they decided to go, well, rock and roll, that's not jazz. So that goes off on another realm. But then jazz actually steps up and becomes almost like the classical music of America at that point. It's had two functions, and I love them both. But we have to say that that's what's happened. We have to look at the fact that the reason why America discovered the greatest musical genius of the 20th century, which was Louis Armstrong, is because of money. Because there was suddenly this new business that was going, right, who's good at this? And Louis stepped in and went, I'm really good at it. And on top of this, his wife...
two things, right? His wife.
Yeah, his wife was... He would have been useless without his wife actually organised it. And so Lil Hardin, is one of the most important women... I would say...
Thank you for saying
top that. Top three most important women musicians. And a brilliant musician, because she played with Louis Armstrong in the Hot Fives.
I believe she's
none of this you can say. You can't say it.
Well, we're saying it.
But we're saying it now, I think we're going to get labelled as trying to erase people. And I'm going, who's erasing who? Lil Hardin.
There's no erasing going on. Let's be clear.
We're not doing it. We're going to get accused of it. That's
fine. I got accused of a lot of things by people I don't know. So it watered off a duck me. I've been married 3 times too. I'm used to, I understand when women start screaming. Water off a duck. But seriously, there's no one's talking about erasing. That's another thing I think it's important to establish is I see jazz as like a magical, ever expanding buffet table that always makes room for more people. That's kind of more of a helpful metaphor for how jazz expanded around the world. Jazz isn't just American anymore. The English make great jazz, the Japanese, Russian, Brazilians. It's everywhere, all over the world. But going back in history, we realized we left some people out of the equation, and there's room to invite them back to the table. All the identities you described, the Creole, the Mexican, the Chinese, the Native American, the Irish, the Spanish, the Jewish, there's room for everyone. But there's a lot of pushback because people see that as challenging this institutionalized, curriculum-based answer, these little pat, simple tropes, the rhythm of jazz comes from Africa, and it's almost like gatekeeping or some sort of what's the term people like to use when they validate themselves? It'll come to me. There's one of these nifty new PhD terms, virtue signaling. So it's like a gatekeeping thing. If you say that, oh yeah, the rhythm of jazz is African. Oh yeah, well then you're in. We're good. We understand. But that oversimplifies the complexities that make this music what it is. It's a very complex gumbo that took place in America, as you say. Now, here's the thing: the women. Lil Hardin is probably one of the most important women. I would argue she may actually be the genius behind Louis Armstrong.
I agree. I agree.
A couple other, Alberta Hunter,
Mr. Rosetta Tharpe. There's another one that is basically, it doesn't matter how you look at it. If you look at it, you're going about Ike Turner, Fats Domino. Sister Rosetta Tharpe is bringing together the blues, gospel, jazz, all in one, late 30s, 1940s. She basically played electric guitar, playing stinging guitar solos with as much distortion. She's invented rock music. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, I would put her.
She's great. She's a little later in the timeline. You go back early. We have Ma Rainey.
But Ma Rainey's not playing electric guitar. That's the point. What Sister Rosetta Tharpe is not
talking about
blues.
I'm talking about the innovators of jazz. I'm going back before we get to Ma Rainey and electric guitar. One of the most important women were what get labeled as the blues shouters, and they're improvising lyrics in nightclubs, and people like Louis Armstrong are growing up and hearing these women improvise a story to speak directly to the people in their audience. The point is, one of the little pin marks I dropped earlier was your talk about Cab Calloway. His older sister's name is Blanche. Blanche Calloway is hugely responsible for getting Cab up to speed. She had an incredible career herself, and from what I've read, actually helped to train and inspire Cab in a big way. The history of women, the role women played is way beyond just being mothers and teachers, although that's an overlooked thing. It's really interesting. If you Google search a lot of jazz history, you'll see men described as a banjo player in a minstrelsy show who was married to so-and-so, but his primary definition is as a musician. Women will oftentimes be described as the wife of, who had this many children. You read down the history, and she happened to teach organ to everyone in town. She taught her sons how to read music and play organ, and these are the guys that come and become innovators. So you have great women teaching a lot of music.
What you're describing is something that goes back to the UK or Britain around about 1000 AD. The church decided that they would not have cousin marriage. They would not have that type of family, which around the whole world, that was the family structure. So over the whole world, you had these very tight family structures because they had cousin marriage, or people would marry their uncle. In the UK, we stopped doing that, and we broke down the family structure. So the family that goes down to the nuclear family in the UK, and then that actually means your bonds are much more wider because you're not creating your family. Now, those immigrants that went through to America, plus the fact that the Enlightenment philosophers wrote that into the Constitution, I've read academic work. There's that the church doing that basically creates sort of the Western democratic model. So the problem you've got here
I'd like to get a link to that. That's interesting.
Yeah. The thing is that if you went to India and you said, "Who's that man?" they would go, "He's the son of so and so." In the same way as you go, they're the wife, because this is a very Western thing to describe someone by their job.
That's right.
And in a sort of in the patriarchy, which is the Western liberal democracy, men get treated in that sort of non-family way, and women don't.
I'm an inventor.
And the thing is, when I argue against these things, people think I'm arguing against some of the tenets of identity. And I'm not. What I'm saying is that if you actually study it and look at what's going on, you start to get an idea of how people thought of themselves then, because we're looking at it through the lens now. Now, one of the things that's happened here, which I think has affected this, is that when the Reagan government came in the 1980s, they changed the funding. Yeah, when Ronald Reagan came in, he changed the funding structure. So up until the 60s and 70s.
We like to say he took the arts out of the schools. That's the easy way to put it. Yeah.
And he would not.
Actually, you know what? Hold on. He was behind the change, which ties in with what you said about your grant writing opportunities in England.
That's what I'm saying.
Reagan did that in America, and we had what's called the National Endowment of the Arts, the NEA. The NEA used to grant awards of cash directly to individuals. I believe it was when Reagan came along, and that all changed.
And what you've got, you move from an individual doing some piece of art which is so avant-garde that it won't be funded,
to a non-profit organization.
Yeah, so
it goes into the wealthy organizations.
It goes into the wealthy organizations, and the thing is that what jazz saw as the jazz fusion was dying, the jazz fusion had moved jazz out. The thing is, a lot of the innovations.
I love jazz fusion, man. I love jazz fusion.
But a lot of the innovations that jazz make, the real power of it is outside of jazz. That's the thing. And so
wait. Whoa, that's deep. Wow. The power of jazz is outside of jazz? What do you mean by that, Andy Edwards?
Look at Louis Armstrong. You put a Louis Armstrong record on. We're talking 1926. That's
when he was on fire.
Yeah, they've just invented the microphone in 1925, so a year after the microphone. And what's he doing? He is doing voiceovers on records. Right? That's why he's a genius, because he comes in and he goes, "Hey guys, what are we going to do? I don't know what we're going to do. Well, why don't we play?" He does stuff like that. That's the genius of it.
He brought the show into the studio.
Yeah, and then he basically reinvents the recording music business. He reinvents every aspect of it, because jazz.
I know you're getting excited, but you just admitted in 1917 they did a great marketing job of inventing, 250,000 records.
Marketing that when they took the ODG, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, into the studio, they thought it would be a minor novelty hit, and the reason was Very Stable Blues has got loads of instruments making the sounds of animals, neighs and things like that, and they didn't understand that was like people are buying records and they're getting Caruso singing this and maybe someone reciting some Shakespeare, and then suddenly instruments are sounding like animals. Do classical musicians do that? No, classical musicians can't do that, and that's why it was. And then the beat was like thrash metal beat level. The thing that really annoys.
I'm glad you say that. Because people don't understand. We tend to listen. We'll listen to records from that area, and a lot of people will go, "Oh my God, that's so cheesy. That's like ridiculous cartoon music." And yet, but to them at that time,
because it influenced cartoon music. That's why. This is the thing that is
the point I'm getting at is what you described is the reaction at the time was like, "Holy crap, what is this?" It was like heavy metal. It was mind-bogglingly different. I heard that they even one of the guys in the studio had the genius, the photographer. They asked the guys to sit off kilter with their instruments. Usually photography was more formal. Just that. And they, if you look at the band, they're relaxed, they're laying over, they're being goofy, or like they're jumping on sort of a neo. What's the word? they're ahead of themselves with a modernist. My
Well,
vocabulary.
I'll tell you something that I think I've uncovered, and I don't think anyone else has said this.
What did you uncover that no one else
Original
has?
Dixieland Jazz Band and Nick LaRocca, that goes back to around about 1910, 1907. That band wasn't formed to jump onto the bandwagon of jazz. Those musicians have been playing for a while, and all those musicians...
They've been playing enough. Papa Jack Lane's.
Yeah, so if you go back to Papa Jack Lane's band, Papa Jack Lane, and there's a really brilliant interview with him where he goes, did you ever have any black musicians in your group? Now, we're talking about 1890s, maybe even 1880s, where they're playing in these parks. And he goes, no, I would never let a black musician into my group. And they were said, no.
Did.
And he said, yeah. And he goes, they used to come and try and steal the music off me. Now, everybody at that time is also trying to claim that they invented it. And the truth is they all did. But
what's funny about your story is that Papa Jack Lane actually gets credit for leading interracial bands.
Yeah, because they stuck in. And he was going,
he didn't know it. He didn't know it. But yeah.
Because
these black people were passing, because they weren't African black, they were a mixture of American.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that in the 1890s, 1895, it was legally.
Well, the funny thing is he was an Italian guy who married a Cuban woman, so he himself was playing with fire.
Yeah. I mean, but the thing I find and this is the big thing that really just destroys the arguments that's going on here, is that when he said black people were sneaking into his band, he's talking about people that were 1/8 black.
Octamaroons, as they like to call them.
Because that was what black, the definition of black then. So you could have someone in the modern lens reading up and saying, oh, this person was black. Homer Plessy was black. Homer Plessy went on that carriage in 1895. He went into a white's carriage, sat on it. He got arrested. They went to court. He lost the case. That brought in Jim Crow. You go and look it up. Homer Plessy was 1/8 black.
This is what I mean about definitions, and our job to help open a discussion so people stop using these general terms that get us into trouble.
And I've said this over and over again. Go and look at the Buddy Bolden band. There's one bloke sat there. He doesn't look black to me. He looks a little bit more on the Mexican side. I don't know, but maybe And then the band that Dee Dee Chandler was in. What was that? In 1897, there's a photograph, and this is an incredible photograph because it's a photograph of a black band in 1897. It's way before
the Emperor Orchestra.
What was it? The Onward Jazz Band?
Could have been the Olympia or the
Onward Jazz Band. And there's one bloke sat in the back of that. Now, I'm not saying he's white. He looks like he's, he's big. I mean, they're all mixed race. I mean, this is bloody obvious. It's New Orleans.
Well, okay, so this is what it is no one was categorizing people's, the whole black and white is a false dichotomy.
Oh, please.
It wasn't
that's the only thing you could arrive at. It's false dichotomy.
Yeah, before then they had all kinds of terms used, octamaroons, maroons, Creoles. They had, mixed races, colored people, and there was plenty of racism between the groups. It's a complex relationship, but very few, if any, people were just saying black or white.
Yeah.
There's
another issue here that no one discusses.
When Italians didn't see themselves as white. When they came over in the 1800s, they were so discriminated against.
Yeah, totally. But the other thing is that if you say, well, look at the true two geniuses of jazz, Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, you couldn't get two people that are further apart in terms of wealth, class. To try and lump them into the same group is bonkers because they're two completely different. I mean, Jelly Roll Morton, his family ostracized him for going down and playing this type of music. So the history is far more complex.
Grandmother kicked him out of the house.
What's really interesting as we're going through this is the one group we're not mentioning is the Native Americans.
Right, and they're there. They're mixed.
They're there. Of course, they're there.
And Duke Ellington is part Native American, and so is Wynton Marsalis. And all of the Wynton Marsalis brothers, and they don't talk about it.
Why do you think, when you got someone like Charlie Parker, who's so important, who is part
he's part Native American too.
Why is it described as black and not Native
Well,
American?
that's a great question. And you have to ask the people who are describing him as black why they do. But what happens when there is a point in American history where forces were crushing and pushing towards this point, maybe somewhere around 1920 when you have the Harlem Renaissance. At a certain point, you had forces from the government that were trying to simplify. The U.S. government became hip to the idea that black people who had Native American roots were calling themselves Native Americans to avoid paying taxes. Because the Native Americans, although they were recognized as a sovereign people, they did not have citizenship. They weren't recognized as citizens. They didn't have the rights of full citizenship. They could get them. They had to basically sell out their. They had to turn their back on everything native and become Christian tax-paying people, capitalists. But in large part, so back in the mid to late 1800s, some of the southern state governors caught on to this and said, no, 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 we can't have people not paying taxes. So you can't, there will be no more Native American. So in some cases, they just went to the census records and erased Native American. They just erased the word out. And you either had no identity or they wrote one in for you. You became either white or black. There may have been another category at the time. I can't remember. But that
And this
was
is in the
part.
30s, was it?
No, we're talking about the 18, well, yes, there was some things codified into law by the 1930s. But
Yeah,
this
because
is
that's what I
this
read
is
about, is that change in the 1930s.
well, but these things started happening. It started happening in New Orleans, for example, when the U.S. bought the territory back from France, the Louisiana territory, and it became part of America. Up to that point, that area had been infused with a lot of Spanish and French people. The French were notorious. The Catholic French had given the black slaves, the African Americans, the Haitians that had come up after the Haitian Revolution. They had considerably more rights. They owned land. They were sometimes slave owners themselves. They were a different class of people. They were literate, schooled, land owning, business owning people. And then you had the African American slaves, the plantation slaves, who were dirt poor, and and after the Louisiana Purchase, that land was opened up to a lot of white
Mm.
European colonizing settlers who
And we're
came
talking,
in
this
and
is around about 1804, is it, the Louisiana
that's
Purchase?
right.
Before
That's when
so
this starts.
yep.
Over the next, 60, 70 years from 1804 forward, we've got basically a land rush. People are coming into this new American territory and they're seeing that the juicy bits, all the perfect land was taken by these black people. Well, they were Creoles from Haiti via Cuba and whatnot, Jean de Calour or whatever. There were people who were used to having a higher social standing that was actually encoded into law by the French kings. Um, so what the U.S. government started to do in order to appease the white settlers who wanted those good pieces of land is started to whittle away at the rights of these colored people and kind of crush their higher social standing and push them out. And eventually, so you get this Creole and black slave, and they're starting to be pushed together. And when jazz is born, you've got this friction because the laws in the U.S. were not honoring these people as being, Creoles, literate people who took
I,
job.
I, I actually think that is the thing that lights the fire of jazz. So
That lights the fire.
that's
So by
that
the
is
night,
it's that there, and that's why black people and Creole people are so important to it.
they're so important. They're
Yeah, and
so
it's a
important.
specific history that no one actually says. They
It's
don't.
because it's complicated. It's so
Yeah,
complicated, and it's complicated because there's so much internal strife. There's a lot. You'll read the biographies of these early jazz guys, the Sidney Bechet and the Warren Dodds,
mm,
the Baby Dodds. They tell you how racist the Creoles were towards the black slaves and vice versa. I mean, there was
mm,
fierce resentments, and of course, the Creoles. The more they were pushed down to the level of a common black slave with no rights in America, the more resentful they got. They're like, "Hey, wait a minute! I'm not black. I'm not
yeah,
black." We have Jelly Roll Morton told one of his friends, "I'm white." Jelly Roll Morton actually said, "I'm white." And what's interesting, Andy, is if people now want to go back and say he's wrong, these are the same people that better be ready to tell trans people that they were never trans, because that's, you're going back in time and reworking identity politics with your
because identity
philosophy.
politics sits underneath politics. And so what they're really trying to do is get people to think a certain way, act a certain way.
That's right. That's right.
So yeah, this is. I mean, that's very interesting.
Let me finish that off, because up to then there wasn't just a black culture. There wasn't a black culture. There were oppressed peoples for sure, and there were a lot of African Americans and descendants, and it was mixed. But by the 1910s, 1920s, when on the East Coast of the U.S. we've got really literate, university trained African Americans writing, we get the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah.
And at this point, we get very intelligent, literate people trying desperately to provide an identity and a history and a legitimacy and pride in being who you are. That's when the cohesion of Black became really important, and that's when people of color really started to come together, at least in the intellectual East Coast version, you know.
But I believe what happened at that in the Harlem Renaissance is that then there's a split, and what you get within that the identity of African Americans is some people saying we want to be a part of America, we want to have this, we want to have our businesses, we want to integrate, we want to have this, you know, why are we being kept out of it? And then there was another wing, which was say like Marcus Garvey, got William Du Bois, he's sort of in the middle, so you got that Pan-African moves, and then right on the other side you've got someone like Marcus Garvey looking with jealousy at Mussolini, go, look what they've done there, this is exactly what we need, you know, with the black, you know, for black people. So what you've got is a war going on, and I can see it in America that you've got some black identity politics saying we should be separate with our own stuff, and then others saying no, we want to be integrated, and there's a confusion. So when people try to not be racist, they're going, oh well, you know, you should have a little black people coming in, you know. So you know, I saw someone the other day what was his name? He was arguing for totally arguing for black spaces, black only spaces. They were saying, you know, why don't we just get like a state, and and everyone would go, and then you wouldn't have these problems. And I've got to be honest, is that some people might think that's a good thing. People might think it's a bad thing. I'm very much like, I want everyone to get on, and I want people to work with each other, and I want people to integrate with each other. I don't like this idea of separatism at all.
That's just the thing. That's the thing, Andy, is it's important to maintain our cultural individual identities, but governments take advantage of this and inflame this infighting. There's no reason for us to be pitted against each other this way. But
don't you think cultural identities, like I was working with these Ugandan musicians that came over, incredible. It was incredible. It was a joy. And this group is like so alien to what I'm used to, because they sing, they dance, they play percussion, they play instruments. So you're getting involved in this, and you're working with these drummers, and they're like doing all those, you know, like 6/8 rhythms. And then when it really hits it, they drop the drums and they start doing this dancing, and I'm playing off the dancing, you know. And this one guy comes up to me and he says, he goes, "You've got it." He says, a lot of British people, they don't get it. And he says, "You've got it." And he goes, why is that? And I went, "Yeah, but don't tell anyone, I'm black on the inside." And they all burst out laughing, because we're there to share that the culture should be, that it's for everybody. And with jazz, it bloody is, you know. And it's like in Britain, and America's the same, is if you're British, that culture, you could be culturally British 100%. It's got nothing to do with your skin colour. Nothing to do with your skin colour. We had a boxer here called Chris Eubanks, and he was famous because he would walk around in tweed suits, and he would look a little bit like Sherlock Holmes, you know, and he did had the walking stick, and he was like the archetypical English gentleman, and no one thought, well, why is he's black though? No one thought that, because you can. And I have that approach to culture, is that I don't believe in cultural appropriation. I don't believe that you can't speak on behalf of somebody else who you've interviewed. It's all there.
And by the way, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone. This movie is just putting them out.
I can't see what
Yeah.
is wrong with that. I can't see what
We,
is wrong with
well,
it.
every human has the right to say whatever's on their mind. I mean, I can speak about anything I observe. That's our right. Of course we do.
When
Um,
in the early, I don't know, about 10, 15 years ago, I got contacted by three different biographers of Robert Plant. And I won't say which one it was, but one of them came up to do this. It's the big Robert Plant biography.
that's
And
great.
so I sit down and he goes, he says, what was it like playing with Robert? And I said, it was absolutely amazing. It was incredible. Best moment of my life. Can you imagine that you're playing Robert? I said, brilliant. And he goes, you must have been nervous playing that stuff. And I went, oh God, we were really nervous. We were really nervous. Right. I said, and he goes, why was that? And he goes, well, we just wanted to keep Robert happy and do a really good job for him. So, I was there just trying to keep Robert happy. The book comes out. So Andy Edwards, what was it like playing with Robert Plant? It was really nerve-wracking. I had to just try and keep Robert happy.
Wow, this is great. You've got to be so careful and calculated with what you say to anyone these days.
Well, the thing is that I believe if somebody steps into the arena, right? The thing is, I could have said, because I told my mate about it, who
Control the
knows
narrative.
Rob, and he just said, well, why did you do the interview for? I said, did they pay you? I went, no. And he goes, so what do you do it for? And I walked out and said, yeah, I suppose so. This bloke's come along, interviewed me. I did say it. He's edited
Yeah, well,
I don't want to take his editing rights away because that would be an infringement on his creative. That would be worse. So you just have to take it. And if you don't want to take it, don't
sure.
do the interview.
Well, there you go, and also be very very present, and aware of what you're saying. I think
Yeah.
that's part of like when a new generation has to learn how to cross a street because now we have cars that go fast. You have to learn a new skill to adapt to changing technology. Well, I think we live in an era where people have to be careful about what they say on interviews. You and I kind of let the filters off, but I was thinking of this today. Back in the 1940s and 50s, the Frank Sinatra era, Nat King Cole. People, you never read in a newspaper about these guys swearing or trash talking other guys. Rarely. There was a civility of discourse and there was an understanding because these guys swear. You're in a bar, you're drinking, we're musicians, we're going to talk some smack about people. But the understanding was a news reporter was a gentleman and wouldn't report that kind of crap. So they could conduct themselves less filtered. We live in an era where you got to be careful what you say because people love to edit and they don't really have your back, Andy. They want to sell their product, and saying it's nerve-wracking is a little more dramatic, I guess. But what you did is you contributed to history. It's awesome. You deserve to be in that story because you're part of it. So you've helped etch out another place in history, and now you have a reason and a place to correct the record or to amend the record, and
That
you
is
can actually,
exactly it. Yeah, that's exactly
yeah,
it. There is no point in making documentaries or having YouTube videos or doing involved in any of this if you can't have the guts to say what you think.
that's right.
Be humble enough to admit when you get it wrong, right? I have had so much pushback about my interpretation of jazz history. And I have to be honest, a year or so later, my knowledge of jazz history is way better than it was back then because people have put me to task and to test. And there has been many, many things where I thought they've got a point there. So why is that? And then I've been able to think my way through it.
That's
But
great.
I have a moral, and this is just my moral compass. And I believe anyone can have their own moral compass. I'm not going to say what you should believe or not. But my moral compass is that we're all human beings, that music's made out
Yes.
of love. We try and spread love,
Yes.
and I'm always trying to come from that. So if I'm getting annoyed that somebody is, let me put it like this: when someone says jazz is black music, my actual gut reaction is I feel like why are people doing that to black people? Why is it that their music's getting called black? Because I'm white and nobody ever calls my music white. And I feel my privilege because white people would never get pulled into that trap. Oh, classical music, that's white music, isn't it? We would never that, okay, because we're going to make sure our music is the top music, and it's
You
never
know,
going to be sullied. It's never going to be put down by a category like that.
I got to ask you, you're a European guy, a white Indian guy. Something I don't think Americans think about is when did Europeans become aware that they are white people, like Germans and, these classical music originators, if you will, the Germans, the Italians, the French. I'd be interested in the history of that. When did they become a group of
Uh,
white people?
my knowledge of class. If I take,
Are
if
Spanish people white? Are Spanish people white? People
Well,
from Spain,
I've got
because
I've
they're
got
right
friends
next
who are
door to the
African,
French.
and they're continually frustrated that everyone's going, in Africa they do this, or in Africa it's like this, and they're going,
Oh, really?
it's 3 times the size of Europe.
But
It's
just
like,
about every country in the world can fit inside of Africa.
yeah, and it's like, it's like, am I like if I was half Spanish, I'd be going, I'm half Spanish, because it would be different, you see, or I'm half
Yeah.
Italian, or I'm half French, but the thing is, all of those categories are countries. You could have Italian music, right? You could
I
have
think that
French
the need
classical
to
music.
categorize is a sports mentality. It really is like some kind of a sport mentality. People just want a simple way of knowing what team you're on. Are you white? Are you black? Are you a jazz musician? Are you African? And it's like the world is far more complex than that. But it's partly the sport mentality and it's part pride. People want ownership over part of history or inventions. They want to,
It
there's a
could be that.
need
I think that I can remember doing some studies, neuroscience studies on disgust, and so basically, there are
on
three.
disgust.
Yeah, there's basically three moral attributes, and they're not related. So the first moral attribute we learn as children is disgust. So our morality is based upon what's been contaminated. I don't want to touch that; it's dirty. Oh, so and so touched that, and I don't like that. So we have this idea of disgust, and then when we become a teenager, develop another morality on top of that, which is adhering to the communal group, conforming to the group. So good people conform to the group. And then when you become an adult, and that's quite a complex process, you hopefully then go, oh no, let everyone do what they want to do. They're all individuals. If you want to do that, that's fine, and I'll get on and I'll do that. So we have these three competing moral attributes in us. Now, because for literally millennia, they're not even tribes, we belonged into family groups which were big, not like the nuclear family, as I said before. We belonged to large family groups, so they were recognizable. You were a so-and-so. And then that plays out that if you'd have gone into America before it had been, I was going to say invaded, to taken over, what you would have found is 100,000 tribes, all completely different, who all were like at each other because they were, and you'd go, are you a member of my tribe? You look like you are. Okay, well, you're in with us. And I think that the disgust urge that we had was the morality of the disgust urge was put onto this family ties. So I think there is a morality that exists that goes, that person is not one of us. And then that is then balanced by a sort of communitarian view and then an individualistic view. If you look at politics, you can see when you go right to the far ends, it's because people, when you measure them from a neuroscience, they can tend to be more communitarian, or some people are more individualistic. I'm one of those types, or people are real disgust types.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that I just don't like gay people. Well, I just don't like them. They do dirty, horrible things. I shouldn't have them. That is the same. That's what's going on. And that is human history all the way through. And we need all of them. We need all of them. But what we're seeing here is this idea being played out. So there's some people going, oh, you should be conforming to the group. I'm a member of the black community. And this is
Well,
what
I think you nailed it. It's a very intriguing theory, but I think you nailed it at the top end when you said that disgust is throughout your word. It's not natural. It's taught, and that's the key.
Well, you know how they studied it. What they did is they got people. They give them a sterilized cup, and then they'd get them to dribble their own spit into the cup, and then they'd say, "Can you drink that back?" And people, even though it's completely irrational, because that's a sterilized cup and your own spit, there are people that believe when you dribble into that cup, your own spit is now contaminated by otherness, not you. And some people, the very thought of that makes them feel sick. Some people could do it. Some people would be quite happy to do it. And so they were able to measure that that level of disgust is spread out throughout the population.
Say that again. Who spit into whose cup?
You spit into you dribble into your own cup. Your own
and they want you to
cup.
They want you to drink your own.
And then you hold it out there. They say, "Can you drink it back?" And you drink it back.
I wonder what it would have happened if they pricked your finger and put a drop of blood, because it seems like humans are more. I'm not going to get into cannibalism or anything, but I think it's easier for humans to drink our own blood, rather than.
That's exactly the same thing. Yeah. This is we operate like this, you know.
But the thing is, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I think if we look at all the differences, men and women get along in general. I mean, we coexist, and no one thinks, what are all these women doing in the same space as these men? And I think it could be the same with all races and all colors of people. We're all earthlings. We're all natives of this earth. I mean, unless you want to talk about Martians seeding this planet with Venetians and whatever, but we're one people here, really, with fantastic distinctions. We've all got incredible distinctions that are important, and they're great to maintain. But
my point is having a culture that's linked to your country. It's wonderful, and you can celebrate that, And I could think of Spain. And I would actually want to go, you should preserve that in Spain. You don't want to lose all your buildings and your nice stuff. And the blokes with their classical guitars tapping their feet and clapping, I love it all. It's great. And you know what it is, you see. With black people that were displaced to America, they haven't got that. That's your central problem here, is they haven't got that. So
that's what I said on our very first show. That's what I believe. A lot of the African Americans who were enslaved in America were robbed of any history and legacy. They've got to recreate one. Well, they've got one now.
And the problem with that is this happened in Germany. Germany was formed in 1850, 1860. And then in that void of there not being a country, Wagner comes in and he goes, well, we've got this historic, the ring cycle and all these types of things. And then within that sort of idea of creating from scratch this identity that moves up and up and up and up, and it ends up with the Nazis in the 1930s and the 1940s, because that's the danger of trying to construct one rather than just going, I'm British, and that's what our culture is. And that's the awful crime. That's the stain against black people in America. That's the stain of America. And jazz is a product of that stain. I would never say that's not the case, but the problem is what's the solution? You see, and the thing is, I'm starting to realize is I've gone so deep into this and thought about the reason why there is a solution, because it's really hard to have a solution, really hard. So if you take Trump going to stop the immigrants at the borders, right? And some people go, oh no, we should let them in. The truth is, trying to do either of those is unbelievably hard to do.
But you've got to try. That's the thing is we don't always know the solution, but we have to try. We have to take action and try, as long as we're able to learn.
It means talking to each other, doesn't it? And taking all the ideas in, and everyone going, oh, that could work, or that could work. And then what you'll have will be a compromise. It'll always be a compromise. And I think Western liberal democracy and jazz is a compromise. I think that's the whole thing. It's a beautiful compromise. And I'm sat here arguing what I think are quite moral values, but I'm getting it in the neck all the time. You've done exactly the same thing. You've gone out, with this idea that women aren't being, because that's where it really started, wasn't it? You were like, women aren't being represented in jazz. I've talked to many female jazz musicians, and they're just resigned to the fact that that they'll be expected to sing. They'll be expected to sing, and if they do sing, then they won't be valued as a player.
What's interesting is I've found a drum instructor in the Boston area from I think the late 1800s. He kept meticulous records of his students, and he had many female drum students, some who went on to lead all women bands, some who would sub for him and his group. but in America there is a history of gendered instrumentation, and that's what was really interesting when I first learned about the all, well, back then they were called all girl bands, the all women bands of the 1940s that actually were formed in the 30s in some cases. My mind was blown. Like, why aren't these women in the history books? Why was I able to perform for 35, 40 years as a professional jazz musician and never hear about these all women bands? And that's what got me to thinking, why? Where does that story go? Why does it not get reported or published or taught in the classroom by otherwise intelligent, knowledgeable professors? So that began my quest into We Are Here, Women in Jazz.
I've got two interesting stories here with that. The best example of this is Nina Simone, because Nina Simone was classically trained, a genius musician, genius composer, really is one of the greats. But for her to be able to get into this industry, because she's one of the few known jazz musicians, she had to sing. And she couldn't get access to classical world tour. So then she's demoted down to jazz, rhythm and blues. And when you listen to, her first single, which is that, my baby's not good. It's a pop song, really. So she has to go down that route. But my favorite story of this is that Aretha Franklin was a keyboardist, pianist. Her favorite musician was Art Tatum. Right, when she first got signed as a young girl, she got put in this studio, and the producers and the musicians are all arguing about how her track is going to go. And she sat there all quiet in the corner, the little girl, young black girl, all these musicians, and she didn't know what to do. So she walked over to the piano and she hit one chord. And with that one chord, the room shut up and the musicians recognized her. And then she started telling, well, I would like this to happen, because she had the ability to do that. Now, Aretha Franklin is possibly the greatest female popular singer of the last 60 years. I mean, but my God, we never think of her as a pianist.
I love Nancy Wilson. I'm a big Nancy Wilson fan.
But these are musicians, and I wonder how many musicians have had to come through the industry and get up front and sing when actually
that's just not a gender thing. I mean, look at Nat King Cole too. He was a great jazz piano player, but part of that's the timing and the market. I mean, I know where you're going on the one hand, but on the other, if the marketplace values singers, then and you want to be a star, then you have to sing.
But my point is that is the only route.
I mean, and Louis Armstrong ended up.
There's evidence. There's loads of female musicians that sung because they couldn't have been just a keyboard pianist or just whatever instrument they play. I think that's quite apparent. I just don't believe that that these musicians weren't being produced. So I think that there's a different route in. I'm friends with a jazz pianist called Wendy Kirkland, and she's been on the channel a few times, and she sings. And one of the things I've been very aware of, she's heavyweight jazz pianist, like really heavy. Proper heavy, got the whole thing going on. But I can feel the perception of her in the UK jazz scene is different than if she was just a straight pianist playing. And part of that is the fact she sings, and part of that is because she's female. And I've spoken to her about it quite a bit, and it's just rubbish that we can't.
I wonder how people feel about that, if they resent having to sing. And if you're a good singer and people love you, I would think it would feel good. There's a band in America led by Sherry Miracle, a drummer. It's called the Diva Orchestra. It's all women band, and they're all instrumentalists. To my knowledge, nobody sings. They may do an occasional gig, and they do, backing up singers. They had a man, Clint, I can't remember his name. They backed up a male singer. But point is the entire band, trombone, saxophones, trumpets, they're all women, all kicking ass, and none of them have to sing. And Sherry Miracle, she's going to be in my upcoming film, We Are Here, Women in Jazz. She makes a quick little appearance in Echoes of Tradition, playing drums. She's doing a tasty little brush solo that sets up a segment on R. Carlos Nakai. R. Carlos Nakai, the great Native American flute player in Echoes of Tradition, demonstrates a little improvisation, Native American melody improvised as another means of showing improvisation exists in cultures all over
Another
the world.
interesting thing that I find with Native American culture is that the first real impingement of Native American culture, the Native American culture on American culture, seems to happen in the 1960s, because the whole hippie thing is
What do you
almost
mean,
like
first impingement?
where you really see Native American culture going global, where you get that cultural, where it just
I
reaches
see what you
absolutely
mean.
everybody. Because if you look at Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, or any of those players at that time, they're dressed like Native Americans. Nobody ever sees this, or
Right.
shares.
They might get a little credit for helping to bring light to the cause. Now that
Yeah.
would be seen as appropriation.
Yeah, totally. See, and I just think and when I noticed that the other day, I thought, I think it was, I was looking at Dave Crosby, and he had like this fringy coat on, and then the colours, and he had almost like moccasins on, and he was wearing this outfit, and I thought, that's really interesting, because nobody has ever discussed how you get to there.
Well, it speaks to a big, that's people use their clothes, their wardrobe, their costumes to express a lot of things. And there was a big movement, people who resent being forced into a conformity by wearing things that no one questions. You get up, you put your dress on because you're a woman. You get up, you put a suit on because you're a guy. And the Native American regalia back then was a wonderful way to make a statement that, hey, I'm not controlled by the system. I'm not following lock and step with this corporate American thing. That back then, the Native American represented a people that were connected to the earth. They prioritized the relationship with your environment, with plants, with animals.
I think what I was interested in is, if you look at the journey of jazz, and you take all that, and the way it creates popular music, rock and roll, the way it keeps coming back in and out, and the psychedelia of the 60s is out, and how that relates to free jazz and all this type of thing that's going on. When that emerges, you go, well, look, these people are now dressing in Native American garb. That's really interesting. Now, you go back to the 1890s in New Orleans, and black people are doing it on the parades.
Well, and again, what is black? A lot of those people are actually mixed race. They're black Indians who were not allowed. They were forced to sort of bury their Native American identity, because at a certain time in New Orleans, in the area, if you were Native American, you were killed. You were strung up and killed. So if a lot of those people, the masking, there's a good point, an argument to be made, and it's presented in a film called Rumble. That looks at the Native American influence on rock and roll, but also touches on jazz a little bit. And that is that perhaps a lot of the Mardi Gras celebrations were these black Indians getting a chance to outwardly.
That's what just having the comment. That's what I said is that then when you look the lineage through, what you see, it could be that jazz is the carrier. Jazz could have been the carrier of that, so that it's suddenly exposed in the 1960s. Because
jazz is a carrier. Oh yeah,
it's a carrier of Native American culture.
Well, I guess it's a carrier of everything that comes along, but absolutely, I mean, jazz has the power to carry, it's like DNA, and it just waits for the right time for something to express. It's powerful stuff. It's powerful stuff. Here's one other thought. Going back, we've talked a lot about black in the history of jazz. And I've used the word false dichotomy because I really think when people get derailed into talking about black and white. But here's something that I think trips a lot of people up. A lot of people, when they talk about jazz and black, or jazz and a lot of American accomplishments in American history, they're really going back to the black that was defined by the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, this is a massively important point. Yeah,
it's very important because by then there was more of a homogenized black culture.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Obviously not fully. There's many pockets of different black. There has never been one black. But what's really complicated is when you go back, like you and I do, prior to 1940, and 1940 is 50 years after jazz began. I think you could say 40 years after 30, but in those early years, as you said, there was no homogenized or more central black sense of identity. It was very different. And, New Orleans is a great example of, you had Creoles of color, and you had African American slave descendants of color, and you had all kinds of mixtures in between, the octamaroons, the quad maroons, the maroons, right? So it was never a simple matter of black. And so when people like us start bringing that up, the other people whose definition and idea of black only goes back to like the Harlem Renaissance, they get offended because they think you're undoing. At that point, from the 1940s forward in America, in sports, in music, you see a lot of amazing black culture things happening, because at that point, talk about Native Americans has pretty much been shut down, and all of these black Indians are now just calling themselves black, and then they're even maybe unaware, or it's become culturally insignificant to them. So there's that sensitivity too, because
I'm so glad we've ended up with that point being made, because all the way through my time on this channel, I wanted to get to a certain point, and I've never been able to do it, and I'm going to state it here now, and it's this.
Okay.
The reason why I argue that I didn't think that black people invented jazz is because I believed it was American music form, and it was a low form, it was a popular music form, and it sold records. And suddenly black people could see, because they obviously were greatly involved in this music, they're a part of it, and nobody could kick them out of it. And so in the 1920s, you see the influx at that point of genius musicians. I don't think that King Oliver or Nick LaRocca or Freddie Keppard, they're good players, but they don't possess the genius that suddenly emerges within jazz in the 1920s. And this is because the black American people, they found a way of expressing themselves uniquely, and they make, if you want to argue it in this way or describe it in this way, in the 1920s they make jazz a black music form, and within that is given the sort of building blocks to build soul, funk, and then hip hop, which I would say are black music forms, because I use the term black music, and when I describe black music, what I'm describing is a feel. It's a thing that it's a high standard to which I would like to be able to be measured by. It's that thing of being, one of my proudest moments was the American musician, black guy, bass player, came over, and he worked with Tower Power, and he'd worked with Zigaboo, and the Meters, and all those sort of, those type.
Andy, I got to interject. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been doing more. I was accused of being a robot by one of your on a prior episode. I think it was our AI talk.
And so you think doing all that's good?
Well, I've been doing more to show that if I am a robot, I definitely have more fluidity.
I sat down and played with this guy,
let me ask you: does Robert Plant wish to be known as a black player? Do you think a guy like Robert Plant? So I'm just curious, where does that come from? Because you're toying with a couple of different things. One, I got to say, Andy, be careful when you go back, when you make your statements about jazz history. You still use the word black, and I think it's important that we start trying to use another term when we're talking about the musicians prior to 1920, the Freddie Keppards, the guys that didn't necessarily call themselves black.
They didn't call themselves black, no.
Yeah, so because it gets confusing, because you're conflating a couple of things.
Yeah, that is the problem with identity politics, and like I said at the top of this, it's so hard not to discuss this. It would be much better to call it American music, right? And then look at the individual geniuses and look how those people within this music form were able to create certain things that black communities in America were then able to use to create. Like I was so involved in hip hop, 20 or 30 years ago, and those 4 skill levels that are created in hip hop were totally a way of the black community in America to be able to express themselves across all the art forms, from mixed DJing, freestyle rapping, breakdancing, and what were the other? Because we got rapping and the poetry side, that all of those things that are integrated. Oh, the graffiti art, that's it. And within that,
Banksy.
That is a way, again, for people in deprived black communities to express themselves. And this is something that I would like to highlight. But the problem is, if I try and discuss it, then basically what will get, and I know it's that they go, yeah, but you're a middle-aged white British person, you cannot talk about this. That is the dichotomy. Is that I can't talk about this, you can't talk about this. This is what you've got in trouble for.
Well, but you can talk about anything you want. I'd say just ignore those people. If someone says something like that, they're giving you permission to like ignore them because they're obviously idiots. They're not capable of having a discussion with you that's going to go anywhere deep when they shut you down like that. It's interesting, if I may, to go back. You hit upon a couple of interesting things. Your definition of genius, or your observation that the Freddie Keppards, the Kid Ories, even maybe the Baby Dodds, they were people who existed prior to the geniuses that we saw come out of the 1920s. Well, here's an interesting phenomena. I think perhaps just one component that feeds into that, and this is the idea. It's not my idea. I read this from someone else, and if I remember who, I'll share it with you. I'm a messenger here, but it's the notion that the jazz that was being played in New Orleans by a mixture of colored people, let's call them oppressed people, or and that's not actually that's a pretty close one. Creoles, Black Indians, Europeans, the whole New Orleans gumbo. But particularly with African Americans in New Orleans, it was okay for those people to go out in public and perform as a group, and it was okay for them to dance, to shout, and to get excited. When you're dancing and playing an instrument, it's power. That it's a form of power, especially if you're on stage and you're wearing suits, right? But the racist slave culture of the American South also expected or kind of allowed that because it was a group. There was no individual poking out saying, I'm a man with autonomy. I've got my own agency. I've got the power to solo and to do what I want. Now, Louis Armstrong, when he got to Chicago, which is the North, in America, we had this dividing line of the racist South, presumably. The North was just as racist, but there was more culture and some more lenient laws. But it was when jazz went up the Mississippi River to the northern towns. We say Chicago, that's a generalization. But in Chicago, a guy could stand on stage, Louis Armstrong and like King Joe Oliver before him, and take solos. And that's where the notion of an individual, or the genius, as you like to say, was allowed to grow. And I think these guys are geniuses in New Orleans, but they kept their genius as a group. And that's why that Dixieland or traditional jazz music is so group oriented. There's so many the individuals are playing intricate parts of a group. And part of that is because the culture allowed them to shine, because no one was saying, I'm an individual, free, strong.
But by the 1890s, you had millionaire Black performers who were writing musical shows.
Yeah, mostly on the East Coast. From the East Coast, but not in New Orleans.
No.
For the most part.
That did exist. But the trouble is those have now been erased because they were Black minstrel performers, and the minstrel shows play such a huge part in this, where you did have people stepping forward and becoming stars and traveling all around the country with that.
Sure, yeah.
What I think is very interesting about Louis Armstrong is that when King Oliver goes up north, right, he decides in the New Orleans frontline group to call up Louis Armstrong and invite him into his group, who is a cornet player. So he, as a cornet player, brings another cornet player in. Why?
Well, I think part of it was his chops. King Joe Oliver's chops might have been frying out on him, and a good band leaders always play this fine line, right, Andy? Band leaders benefit by having ringers or great players in their band, as long as they're not stealing.
It's a bit of a strange. It's a real. I mean, you get somebody like to have two trumpet players, right? And I think when they brought him up, the negotiation that they played, because they said that it's like Louis Armstrong had almost finished King Oliver's lines, what that did is that is where the solo is born. And then Louis Armstrong walks into a studio and realizes that if he actually arranges the parts, Jelly Roll Morton did this to a certain point as well. So when you listen to those early Louis Armstrong recordings, the solo is so unbelievably highly developed. And yet you go back to the original Dixieland Jazz Band or any of those early King Olivers, it's not even there. You're talking about 3 or 4 years.
Louis Armstrong was writing. He was writing his solos out. A lot of those musicians actually were not improvising those amazing solos. They worked them out on stage night after night, and they became almost like signature solos. And that's one big myth behind the improvising jazz musician too, is the true improvisers go out night after night, and some nights they just step on their, they just play crap. We're human. The guys that are always putting on a show have worked some ideas out. And the entertainers especially are savvy to this, because they know people are paying a high price ticket to come and see a show. It's very different when you go down to the dive across the tracks and you're at a real jazz club. Then you can just kind of let it, you can do your experimenting. But
also this idea that, there was these underprivileged blacks in New Orleans, and then there's these privileged white musicians that they were swapping over, because one of the most important bands in the development of jazz in New Orleans are the Spasm bands. And these were basically disabled white kids living on the streets who couldn't even afford instruments. They had to build their own instruments, and the Spasm.
Isn't that a bit like skiffle, your English skiffle music?
It's not a bit like it. That is where it starts. There's New Orleans, the skiffle bands. Is it Eugene Chambord? The guy that's, if you look at his gravestone, says, "I invented jazz." Right? This white guy, another one. Well, what's really interesting.
There was a couple. Tom Brown, there was a trombonist.
But the Spasm bands did not play proper instruments, you see. And the Spasm bands in New Orleans actually went for about 6 months over to Leadbelly's town and actually jammed on the streets there for about 6 months. So Leadbelly undoubtedly heard the Spasm bands. And then when Leadbelly gets picked up in the 1930s and he starts to sell millions of records, here in the UK, it's Lonnie Donegan that discovers, well, it was actually, I think Cyril Davis before him, they discover Leadbelly and they start doing those tunes. And then those skiffle bands, they pick up what the Spasm bands did. They start to build their own instruments, which is the Beatles. So this is what I'm saying about the influence being outside jazz. If you look at the Beatles and Jeff Beck and Led Zeppelin and all those bands that were born in the skiffle craze in the UK, that goes directly back to New Orleans. Back to New Orleans.
Oh yeah, it's an amazing. England. And it's getting late. We might have to wrap up, but I've come across some things that show an even tighter relationship between England and early jazz in America, including some of these early bands.
You know what fried my head? I interviewed Simon Phillips the other day, and I.
Did you? Oh, that's cool, man.
And I know, because I know my history. I decided to chat about his dad, because his dad was like a superstar big band musician here in the UK, Sid Phillips. And I said, when did Sid Phillips first record? And Sid Phillips was recording jazz here in the UK in 1928.
There was records made in England in 1916.
Yeah.
England. In fact, records were made at the same studio that became Abbey Roads.
Yeah.
That's the studio. There's a fascinating history. And here's another thing: the English recording engineers were obviously superior, because you're a drummer. You've heard this trope. And it makes me sick to hear people say, well, drummers were playing wood blocks in the early days because they didn't know how to record snares and bass, and these instruments would blow the conical speaker out. And yes, there were loud noises that could knock the recording needle from, and they'd have to do a whole takeover. But there's recordings made in England with the most beautiful snare drumming and cymbal crashes. There's no distortion at all. Those English recording engineers, man, were nailing it. In at least 1916, I'm sure they had their act together before then. But
But also you got the fact that, a drummer like Baby Dodds started off playing in silent movie picture houses, isn't he? So all those sound effects come from that. And so it
That's a
wasn't like,
huge,
yeah.
the silent movie sound. There were the drummers. The drummers. Here's okay. You've forced my hand here, Andy. But I think some of the innovators of what is unique about jazz are the drummers, and they don't get enough. Anytime you ask a person for a list of innovative jazz musicians, rarely will they ever have a drummer. And yet, where's the beat? They talk about jazz and the feel and the beat.
It's the drummer.
The drummer, and you know this too. I was a marching band drummer. When you put a drummer and they don't read, most drummers start off not reading, especially 100+ years ago. We're making shit up all the time, man. We're playing on everything. That's why we drive people nuts, because everything is a drum. And so you're in a marching band. Everyone else is playing the notes the way they are written. And we're sitting there, now I'm going to play what the clarinet's playing. Now I'm going to do it over here. And you can hear this in proto jazz. The drummers are having a blast and they're propelling the music. And they're playing from start to finish. They're the ones making the whole song feel a certain way. So give the drummer some, man.
But the thing is when you have these conversations and then you say something and I'm thinking, yeah, and then you got that Sousa March craze. You got the Sousa March craze, which is 1860. Ragtime is growing up. And so as you start to discuss it, I know the history well enough to realise that to try and actually nail this down to being anybody or anything is impossible. Because what you've got is you've got America, and America's just charging ahead, and it's just exploding things out.
It's exploding. Yeah, it's like a Big Bang theory. Yeah, you've got so many particles smashing against each other. And that's what makes it unique. I mean, you ask yourself, why didn't this music start in Africa? Why didn't jazz start in Brazil? Brazil had way more African slaves than North America did. And
they didn't go through the pressure cooker of the very specific plantation American system. That's why. That's what I'm saying.
And the Brazilians and the slaves were allowed to keep their instruments, their drums.
Yeah.
So we see this advanced rhythmic. That's where we see Afro rhythms presenting themselves. Is where their drumming.
What do you think they were playing at Congo Square? Pure African rhythms from 400 years before, or like a mixture of, Brazilian rhythms? An idea of what African rhythms would have been like culturally.
Congo Square,
Native American.
You got to remember, Congo Square was sacred Native American land upon which corn harvest ceremonies were done. So your point is quite correct. You were getting a mixture, but also there were new slaves being brought over, even in the middle 1800s. So there were some fresh arrivals that maybe had some, some of them must have been drummers. So we might have had some, direct influence. Yeah. But we're drummers. What do? We blend. We're always trading ideas. So they're sitting in with other guys, and like you say, these Brazilians, the Mexicans, the North Americans. Man,
have you ever known a history that is based upon the idea that in a square in a town in 1830, people were jamming on these rhythms that somehow that influenced the obvious marching rhythms? And 50 years later, it's like bonkers. And see, when I was a kid, I used to read this, history of jazz, first thing, Congo Square. This happened in Congo Square. Then you've got like Buddy Bolden emerging in the early 1900s. I go, well, hey, what did he remember these Congo Square rhythms? How did it get to there? What happened? He doesn't sound like what were they even playing? And the other thing,
well, Buddy Bolden doesn't sound like anything because there's no recording of him. Nobody knows anything about Buddy Bolden aside from one picture and some oral histories. That's another myth that we have to really be careful about.
And it's fascinating because I would love to really reevaluate, because Wynton Marsalis has made a film about him, and in this film,
executive produced the Bolden film.
Where's all this coming from?
No, it's crap. It's propaganda. It's garbage. From a filmmaker's perspective, the first 30 minutes are awesome, actually, I think. And what's ironic is after seeing that movie, I went online. A lot of film critics say that the first 30 minutes of the film are neurotic and terrible. And what was this director thinking? I love the first 30 minutes of that film are great because it conveys a sense of neurotic. It conveys the idea of what a guy going insane, which is what Buddy Bolden did, would be thinking or hearing. And the flashbacks, if you were at one point on the top of your game, a charismatic superstar in your hometown, getting laid, 4 girlfriends walking you home every night, carrying your clothes and your trumpet bag, partying your ass off, and then one day you end up locked alone in a dark cell with nothing. What would be going through your mind? And the opening of this movie, we can see him going back to the memories of these great nights of music that he must have had. The opening is brilliant. The film degenerates. And here's the thing. Wynton Marsalis oversaw the executive production of that. He had a big hand in it. They don't once mention the word Creole in that movie. And Wynton Marsalis is descended from a Creole musician on his mother's side. Shame on Wynton. That's inexcusable to have a movie about jazz in New Orleans and never mention the word Creole, and on top of perpetuating this mythological garbage, which is all ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's fanciful fun, but Buddy Bolden, nobody knows because nobody heard him. Louis Armstrong was maybe 5 years old when Buddy Bolden was institutionalized. If Louis Armstrong heard Buddy play in a marching band, because they don't let 5-year-old kids into nightclubs, if he heard him playing in a marching band when he was 5 years old, and what did that 5-year-old remember? So when Louis talks about hearing Buddy Bolden, I don't buy it.
But you know what band Louis said revolutionized jazz in New Orleans?
Bix Beiderbecke.
No, because Bix wasn't born.
What I mean is later in life, Louis Armstrong said Bix Beiderbecke record
when he
changed
picked up the
jazz.
cornet in 1911 or 1912 or whenever, and he starts playing the cornet, right? When he does that, he starts to listen to the jazz groups in New Orleans. And in the 1930s, he was asked, he said, what was the group in New Orleans at that time? And he said, without doubt, this band revolutionized jazz because of the way they arranged it. Remember, Louis Armstrong was the great arranger, was the original Dixieland jazz band.
Yeah, he gives them a lot of credit for arranging, for having a lineup that was that.
And people think, well, how can he say that? The reason is because Louis Armstrong was living in a melting pot. He was being looked after by Jewish people. He was delivering,
the Karnofsky family.
Yeah, and so what you see that it was a melting pot, and he would not have differentiated this. And I think this is such a shame that this can't be celebrated. That in fact, in America at that time, which was full of so much racism, that
so much racism. Louis Armstrong also said about his experience with the Karnofsky family, they are the ones that bought him his first horn. He was delivering coal with the Karnofsky kids, right. And some of the, delivering to the whorehouses and some other places. But it was a Jewish family. Louis presumably wore the Star of David for the rest of his life. Louis Armstrong wrote that at that time, he wondered why the Black African-American community didn't come together and help the Jews more, because he said the Jews had it worse than the blacks back then in terms of being discriminated against to get work. That's the way Louis Armstrong saw it from his perspective. So these are things that are uncomfortable to say too.
Yeah.
But there he is. That's Louis Armstrong saying the ODJB was influential.
Well, I've got myself into trouble. Another video, I'll be putting it up. Another video that'll be getting me into trouble. Ben, it's been lovely talking to you. I think we'll finish up there because this phone is about to run out of power. So
I heard your bleep. I heard Andy's phone go bleep, and you can see it's dark.
Thanks for that, Ben. We'll get out of here quick, I think.